introduce Professor Alison Stone from the University of Lancaster, who's well known to people here, and she's the co-editor of the Bulletin of Hegel Society, and she's written a number of books: Petrified Intelligence, Nature in Hegel's Philosophy, Nature, Ethics and Gender in German Romanticism and Idealism, books on feminism, feminism and psychoanalysis, the value of popular music from a kind of post-Kantian aesthetics perspective, and being born, which is a big topic. So a number of topics, and today she's going to talk on the topic freedom and nature in Hegel and Schelling, and we'll be here for an hour and a half.
Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. And the handouts seem to have been satisfactorily resolved, so that's good. This paper is one that I've only just written, and this is its first airing. So it may have absolutely fundamental flaws which I'm entirely unaware of, and you'll be able to make me aware of. So this talk is about Hegel, Schelling and freedom in the metaphysical sense rather than social and political sense. Where do Hegel and Schelling stand on the issue of free will versus determinism? Well, recently a number of interpreters have argued that Hegel's a compatibilist. I'm going to start by setting out one possible way of interpreting Hegel as a compatibilist, an interpretation on which the basic form of compatibilism that he's adopting is shared with Schelling. But then in the subsequent parts of the paper, I'll put pressure on this interpretation. So I'm going to first set out a way of taking Hegel and Schelling to be compatibilists, and then raise a number of questions about such a view. So just to make sure at the start that we're all on roughly the same page here, the way that free will versus determinism is standardly framed with respect to the history of modern philosophy gives us the following principal options. First, hard determinism, so the idea that causal determination obtains everywhere in nature, including human beings. Human beings, along with all existence, are fully part of nature, so there's no free will, as the occurrence of each of our decisions or actions is determined by an endless chain of causal antecedents. A second option, a soft determinism, compatibilism. So again, causal determination obtains everywhere in nature. Human beings, as all else, are fully part of nature. But the causal determination of all of our actions or decisions is compatible with our having free will as long as the latter is appropriately understood, i.e., where my actions or decisions are free if they issue in some way from within me, from a source within me, rather than from some external constraint, some causative factor that is somehow outside me. To be sure, there's always some chain of causal determinations that accounts for my having the source in me that prompts the action or decision in question, but as long as it is from some such source internally that I act, then I'm free. And finally, incompatibilism, or voluntarism, or libertarianism, goes under these various names. So human beings can make free decisions and carry out free actions, where these are free in a stronger sense than is the case for compatibilism, and depend upon some sort of power on our part of spontaneity. In exercising this power, we break from the causal determination that obtains throughout nature, and we are acting from some different form or principle of causality. So another way to express these options is that on all of them, nature is a realm of complete causal determination. But on the first and second options, human agents are entirely in nature, so understood. Whereas on the third option, at least some part of the human agent transcends or steps outside from, can step outside from nature. However, both Hegel and Schelling reject that view of nature as exhaustively constituted of chains of efficient causation, i.e. worldly and mechanistic picture of nature. They don't deny that some parts of the natural world operate on the principle of efficient causation, but those parts belong in a hierarchy of levels of nature, rising from the most mechanical to that of organic life. And at that highest organic level of the natural world, we've got organisms which, as the name suggests, are self-organising or self-regulating, or they can be seen as engaging in self-production, self-creation. This self-regulation can't be adequately understood in terms of efficient causation alone. It also involves formal and final causation. And I take it that for Hegel and Schelling alike, that's an ontological claim about how nature, how organisms really are. It's not only an epistemic claim about how we have to think about nature or organisms. Yes. I think it's, yeah. It's just not pointing so much at me now. So formal causation obtains here. Can you still all hear me now? Just put up a hand if you can. Formal causation obtains in that an organism's behaviours and material structures are shaped by its overarching form, its status as an instance of a universal kind. Final causation obtains in that these behaviours and structures come about to realise purposes that are prescribed by the organism's form, such as reproduction, sentience. So in that they're self-organising, organisms exhibit something that approximates to, or comprises a lower level version of, self-determination, which the latter, which characterises human agents or subjects for Hegel and Schelling. So free will is understood in terms of self-determination. Hegel says that pretty much in paragraph 7 of the Philosophy of Right. And self-determination in its turn is equivalent to autonomy, giving laws to oneself and so determining one's actions from a self-imposed law. Such as one of the ones that Hegel mentions earlier in the Philosophy of Right, the law, be a person and respect other persons. Of course, he'll go on far away from that, but that's just one instance of the sorts of law that we mean here. However, our capacity to impose laws on ourselves doesn't depend on any sort of causality that transcends or stands out from the natural world. We might think it did if we took nature to be exclusively mechanical and governed by efficient causation only, because in that case, imposing a law on oneself would seem to require a capacity to break away from nature's chains of efficient causation. And the way in which that would seem to be so is that one would be binding oneself to abide by a law that obliges one, irrespective of whatever varying causal occurrences are taking place on you, within you, or around you, i.e. whatever events are causing me to have such and such desires or impulses at a given time. But anyway, that's not Hegel's view. For him, self-determination is a further development or realisation of the same power of self-regulation that already exists in non-human organisms. For an organism gives something akin to a law to itself, insofar as its behaviours and structures arise in order to realise purposes that follow from its belonging to the kind it does. So on this view of Hegel, self-determination doesn't involve a departure from nature, but a further development of nature. So this position could be seen as a non-standard form of compatibilism, which has the following features. One acts freely, insofar as one's actions arise from within oneself, specifically insofar as they're done from a law that's one's own, that one gives to oneself. But, contrary to the normal version of voluntarism, acting from a law that's one's own doesn't require powers that transcend nature, as distinct from being the further elaboration, complication and development of natural powers. Rather, that's what human self-determination is, a further such elaboration of the self-organisation that characterises organisms generally. Unlike the more standard version of compatibilism, though, the commitment is also to an organicist rather than mechanistic picture of nature, and to free will being understood in terms of autonomy and self-determination in the strong senses that we usually associate with voluntarism, i.e., as requiring something stronger than merely acting from the last appetite and deliberation. It's rather action from a law that one imposes on oneself that obliges, irrespective of the vagaries of one's shifting appetites or sets of internal motivations. So I've described this as non-standard, but the position is potentially not altogether removed from some recent forms of compatibilism, according to which an action is free if it comes from within the self, in the sense that somebody does it on the basis of their character. So I'm going to say something about where character figures, and this will lead into I'll just hold it. I'll hold it like this. Fine. This is okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll talk about character, and that will lead me into beginning to say something more detailed about Hegel and Schelling and the differences between them. So both Hegel and Schelling are reluctant to think that one would be free if one acted from one's character, and yet that character were given rather than chosen. For them, such a view wouldn't allow for autonomy in a sufficiently strong sense. Character itself has to be chosen if one is to act autonomously and act from one's character. So that character is the internalisation of the law one's given to oneself, internalised as an organised set of dispositions. But on the details of this, Hegel and Schelling diverge. Now, Hegel deals with character within the philosophy of right. And as I understand it, he believes that a person's character is the organised structure of their desires, where these desires have become organised over time through the individual's participation in and education by social institutions, those that make up ethical life. This participation over time shapes what we desire, and if the shaping institutions are themselves organised in a rational way, then what happens is that we come to desire to act as is required by reason. In that case, one's acting from one's organised desires, i.e. one's character, but not against reason, but from reason as well, insofar as one's desires have come to embody rational requirements and be structured to reflect those requirements. So here I act freely if I act from my character, and this character embodies rational requirements such that in acting from it, I'm acting as reason requires. However, and I realise in what I'm about to say that some of you may be squirming in your seats, it's not immediately clear that this satisfies the principle that I'm free when I'm acting from a law, including a character that I have given to myself. It might look more as if what Hegel is saying here is that I'm free just when I act as is demanded by a rational society which has instilled its demands within me, and that society is actually a constraining force without me, outside of me, one might think. Thus, Isaiah Berlin's well-known complaint against positive liberty, that the notion takes social constraint and deceitfully misdescribes it as freedom. So one common countermove amongst various recent defenders of Hegel's political philosophy is to say that social institutions for Hegel are actually rationally organised just when they enable human individuals to exercise and realise their freedom qua self-determination. In that case, I'm free just when I act in the ways that are ultimately required to secure the continued existence of my own powers of self-determination and the same powers on the part of others. But putting it that way, on which social institutions are sort of a long way round from my own freedom back to itself, isn't quite right, because then it looks as if institutions are merely instrumental to my achievement of individual freedom, which of course is not how Hegel sees matters. Rather, over the course of the philosophy of life for him, we get a gradual expansion in what we take freedom to consist in. So there's an initial assumption that it consists in bare self-determination, which gets progressively corrected and enlarged. And we learn inter alia that what self-determination properly consists in is acting from requirements of reason, and hence in accordance with social institutions that embody such requirements. Nonetheless, contra Berlin, we're not merely being constrained by external social forces here. The institutions do embody what's necessary to secure my self-determination, albeit when that self-determination on my part is properly understood. Now, the way that Schelling talks about character is very different. So this is in his investigations into the essence of human freedom, and his focus is very much on individuals. There's not this concern with social life and institutions that there was in Hegel's views on character, as I was just presenting. Now, Schelling takes the proto-existentialist view that one acts freely if one makes a choice between at least two options where it's genuinely open which option one takes, and one could have chosen otherwise. Now, what centrally concerns him, as many of you probably know, is choosing between good and evil alternatives, with one's impulses pulling one in both directions and one taking a choice between them. And he's got this broader preoccupation in this essay with attributing full weight to evil, not seeing it as merely a privation or the absence of good, seeing it as pulling on us in its own right, and so on. So that's one of the sort of overarching preoccupations he has, within which he says these things about character. What choice one makes on any given occasion, Schelling says, depends on one's character. Yet it's still a free choice because my character is itself chosen. And at times, he seems to adopt the view that one makes a prior choice of one's character in a noumenal realm, non-empirically and atemporally. So you have this original noumenal choice of one's character, and that then shapes all the choices, the sort of empirical choices that one will make throughout one's life. But there are a number of puzzles around that claim. It looks as if, even if my original choice of my character is free, the subsequent choices that I make on the basis of that character would actually be determined. And then there are various metaphysical puzzles about the nature of this noumenal choice of one's character. However, at other times, Schelling says something different. He also says that this choice of one's own character, quote, doesn't precede life in time, but occurs throughout time. Thus, in making choices between good and evil over time, free choices, I choose my character. And the actions that I choose to perform shape my character, i.e. my entrenched set of dispositions towards good and evil factors. In turn, my character, as it has been shaped by my choices up to a certain time, affects what choices I make at a subsequent time. It doesn't determine those choices, but it sort of puts more weight on one side of the scales. although I can still choose in favour of the side that's got less weight on it. But there's more on the heavier side to draw me that way next time. I'm more in the way of motivations and considerations that I'm used to giving force to. Nonetheless, next time a choice arises, I may defy all that and go for the lighter side of the scales, to stick with this metaphor. So the choice of my character is an empirical matter, but it's not something that occurs on one empirical occasion. It's rather something that takes place in an ongoing process over the whole course of my life, with a process within which my character and my choices over time reciprocally affect one another. So the reason why I said this was a proto-existentialist view is because on it, in making particular choices, I'm also choosing what self I have, self in this sense of character. So whenever I choose, I'm contributing to making myself be whoever I am. And this relates back to what I said about acting from a law that one gives to oneself, because character can be seen, again, as an internalized such law. So that in a sense, I'm free if I act from my character, where in doing so I'm contributing to shaping my own character over time. And that character is like a sort of law within myself. So, okay, having introduced these considerations about character into this picture, I tried to give you of a way in which Hegel and Schelling could be seen as compatibilists. A further bundle of questions has arisen. So in Hegel, there was a question about whether in acting from rational requirements one's embodied by the society around me, whether in doing so I'm really acting from a law that I have given myself. And the sort of set of questions I want to kind of tease out now circle around what both Robert Pippin and Terry Pinkard have talked about as the Kantian paradox. So if I am the one who gives the law governing my actions to myself, then how can I actually be bound by this law? Or conversely, if I am bound by it, then where's the I gone? If I'm genuinely bound by this law through some obligating force that it has, then it ceases to be obvious how I'm acting freely when I act following this law. So what I was trying to suggest is that the worry about Hegel, in terms of what he has to say in the philosophy of right, the worry is that the nomos side of autonomy has absorbed the auto side. Even though Hegel, of course, wants to say that he's reconciling the two. He doesn't want to say one of them swallowed up the other. Now, Schelling conversely stresses that whatever one's character and one's history of choices to date, on any occasion, one still faces a choice between good or evil, where either option remains possible. So what I'm trying to suggest is that perhaps, on the other hand, for Schelling, the auto has absorbed the nomos. So what's good only binds me insofar as I choose to be bound by it, and I keep having to choose it again and again, endlessly. Now, of course, neither Hegel, goodness me. So what happens when you've been reading too many German idealists? Friedrich. Okay, although Hegel and Schelling both tried hard, freedom and reason together, ultimately for Schelling, freedom wins out over reason. This is what I'm going to try to suggest, and conversely for Hegel. And the way that I want to try to show that is by looking at their accounts of nature and the way in which self-organisation in organisms and nature prefigures human autonomy. And this will then finally lead back to the thought that Hegel and Schelling may be incompatibilists after all. Okay, so very quickly, or as quickly as I can do it, Schelling. I've been talking about what he has to say in his essay on human freedom. But I now want to say that what he has to say in that essay about freedom and character comes out of and remains continuous with his view of nature, which dates back to his 1790s period when he was writing his works on the philosophy of nature, whereas the freedom essay is from 1809. And it's controversial to attribute intellectual continuity to Schelling. I'm bracketing that, but I'm happy to discuss that if people want to. So, human agents, we've seen, have the freedom to choose their own characters, to choose between their own competing impulses towards good and evil, and thereby shape their own characters over time, which in turn affects their subsequent choices between good and evil, and so on. Prefiguring this feature of human agents, non-human living organisms produce their own behaviours and structures in the effort to realise their inherent purposes. So they approach the influences and stimuli around them in light of these purposes. They respond to the influences accordingly. They incorporate their responses into their own behaviours and structures so that while organisms are affected by the environment surrounding them, they remain self-produced. So self-production overarches the surrounding chain of efficient causal interactions, so that the operations of efficient causality come to serve formal and final causality. Moreover, this self-production on the part of organisms is prefigured by a prior aspect of free creativity that obtains everywhere in nature. So Schelling says the following about this: at the origin of nature is a pure, productive, active, generative force. This is particularly in his first outline of the system of the philosophy of nature. Without this force, we cannot explain the existence of nature at all, because there must be a productive power to bring anything into being in the first place. Yet productive force can't generate anything determinate unless it gets constrained by a second inhibiting or retarding force. And then different kinds of natural things result from varying combinations and proportions between these two forces. Inhibition, or the retarding force, prevails in the mechanical levels of nature, in which we've got entities that can only act, i.e. move about, in reaction to causal effects exerted on them by other similar entities. Now, the range of levels of nature and natural forms within them arises as the creative force repeatedly tries to extricate itself from the inhibiting force under which it's become confined, so that successively, as we go up through the levels of nature, the balance shifts towards productivity. At each rising level, inhibition confines productivity a bit less than it did before. The result, finally, is organic life, in which productive force prevails over inhibition through the way that those efficient causal interactions with the environment are incorporated into self-production of the organism from its own form and purposes. Now, in producing itself in this way, the organism prefigures the human agent, which, according to Schelling in the Freedom essay, as I said, chooses its actions and chooses the law governing them in the sense of one's character. So Schelling's model of self-chosen character, I think, is continuous with his view of the self-producing organism, even though they're from these texts at a somewhat different period. And that's why I think there is a continuity, in fact, between the philosophy of nature writings and the freedom. But we might think that, well, even if the self-production of organisms by themselves prefigures human self-choice, self-creation of one's own character. Even if the former prefigures the latter, there remains a crucial difference, which talk of human agency further realising organic self-production potentially obscures. For surely an organism doesn't choose its form or purposes. It has a form, the kind to which it belongs, and certain purposes arise from that form. Well, that's true. But that, I think, is precisely the point of Schelling saying that human agency further realises the freedom that is already there, but to a lower level in living organisms. And indeed, within his sort of metaphysics of nature, more broadly, human free choice is a further realisation of nature's creative force. So as human agency, the creative force has extricated itself from the inhibiting force more than ever before. Even so, the advent of human free agency doesn't depend on any forces or principles that were not already present in the rest of nature. The emergence of human agency only involves a shift in the balance between creative and inhibiting force, more predominance of creative force, but not the introduction of any new forces. Okay, so to go back to the issue about the relation between freedom and reason. All stages of nature embody requirements of reason, as Schelling sees it. So one way that this is true is that productive force is acting rationally whenever it bursts beyond the restrictions that inhibiting force has been imposing on it. The way that this is rational is that the productive force is so acting as to try to resolve its opposition with inhibiting force. And the opposition in the sense of having these two opposed forces coexisting in a single kind of natural entity. Now we might think that this is a hopeless sort of expansion of the idea of contradiction and with it reason, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes here. Even if what's at issue, in fact, is a tension between these forces, or some kind of a contrast between the forces, not a strict logical contradiction, it's still possible for Schelling to say that the productive force is acting rationally and trying to get free of this tension, reduce this tension away. So reason is involved in what he has to say about these levels within nature. But nonetheless, it seems to me that the weight within his account of nature and mutatis mutandis of human agency and character, the weight falls on freedom. Without nature's sheer creativity, there would be nothing at all in existence to conform or fail to conform to requirements of reason. The fact that there's anything at all for Schelling is just more basic than whether once existing something conforms or not to reason, or acts according to reason or not. The question of conformity with reason can only arise once something exists. And so, and as we've seen for Schelling, existence is something that has to be traced back to this originary creative force through which there comes to be any existence at all. So that's a way that within his picture of nature we've got a preeminence of freedom over reason. And consequently we see that for him, when it comes to his views on human character, the most fundamental question is whether somebody has chosen to act from good or evil on some given occasion. Schelling's adamant that this is a genuine choice. In any given case, one might choose otherwise than one does. He very much wants to avoid the view that one only acts freely when one does what's good. Even though for him, what it's good to do is what it's rational to do, what everyone rationally has grounds to do. So he also aligns the good with the universal. But still, one might decide to act from reason or to act against reason. So the weight in his account falls ultimately on choice more than reason. The rational course of action is the good one, but one has to choose to do what's rational or not, whether to act from rational considerations or purely individual and self-interested ones. And it's because of this primacy of choice that Schelling locates the ultimate ground of human freedom in a creative sheer upsurge from non-existence into existence, the same upsurge that's at the origins of nature. But this ground of freedom, as he famously puts it, is an abgrund. It's an abyss. There's a sheer upsurge of existence which is non-rational. It obtains before any considerations about rationality can even get going. So in all these ways, I'm trying to say that in the balance between auto and non, for Schelling, auto has preeminence. And I want to suggest that the situation is the converse with Hegel. So Hegel tries to get round the paradox: how can a law bind me if it's given to me only by myself? He tries to get round this by tying freedom and reason together. For him, I'm free just when and insofar as I act from reason, which imposes certain requirements upon me, binding requirements, but where in acting so as to satisfy them, I'm acting freely. But the question is, why acting from reason should be considered as freedom at all? Now, if one's an indeterminist, that's understandable. For then, in acting from reason, I'm acting from a power that transcends nature qua realm of causal determination. So basically, reason sets me free from nature. But Hegel rejects that view of nature. So that means that we need to look a little bit at what he says about nature to understand why it is for him that action from reason still constitutes freedom. Now, Hegel sees nature as a series of stages, chiefly three: the mechanical, physical, and the organic. So in the mechanical stage, we've got nature existing essentially as units of matter that have little or no unifying organisation. In the second physical stage, we've got material bodies that are partly integrated together with one another, but still not fully so. They're related to one another and they're affected by these interrelations, but not completely so. So that's the hallmark for him, amongst other things, of magnetism and electrical relations and chemical processes in which distinct substances react to and transform one another, but they don't become bound together into perpetually self-renewing wholes. And that is achieved in organic life. So for Hegel, animals, plants, and the whole earth as a system of interacting elements all realise the inherent nature of organism to different degrees, namely to have material parts that are as they are, entirely because of their places in the wholes they belong to. A heart, for instance, being the way it is wholly because of its function in pumping blood. So the material parts or members of organisms are shaped by their unifying forms or concepts. So Hegel's taking it here that in an organism, the plan or purpose or concept of the whole organises and assigns roles to all of the material parts. Now for Hegel, that succession of natural stages constitutes a logical progression. Organisms are further in this progression than chemical processes and more advanced than chemical processes, and chemical processes in turn are more advanced than electrical ones, magnetic ones, and so on. Because, by virtue of their internal structure, organisms resolve the tensions within less advanced natural forms. Well, they resolve the tension within chemical processes, and chemical processes resolve the tension within electrical processes, and so on, back and back and back. Chemical bodies, for instance, they're partly related, but they're partly independent of one another, and that's a kind of tension. Organisms avoid that tension by having material parts that are fully shaped by the whole. Nature thus exhibits a progression in that each of its forms resolves tensions within preceding forms, the most advanced being those that maximally resolve all preceding tensions. Well, this also means that nature embodies rationality. It organises itself progressively so as to resolve contradictions, tensions. And this can only be possible if nature has some kind of inner drive within it to resolve tensions, i.e. a level of rational agency. Hegel retains much of the basic structure that Schelling gave to mature philosophy. Hegel, like Schelling, regards nature as a self-organising whole, made up of a series of stages, each overcoming tensions within the preceding stages. Nature organises itself in line with rational requirements, and so the more rationally organised nature comes to be, the more the concept comes to predominate over matter, ultimately in organisms. But the big change is that the concept of force that was so central for Schelling plays no role in Hegel's account. For him, instead, nature is driven to restructure and reshape itself again and again, not because it consists in productive force that needs to get free of being confined by inhibiting force. Nature reorganises itself just because it's rational, and the appeal to productive force becomes redundant. Okay, well now we can see Hegel's implicit answer to the question, why should acting from reason constitute free action? Acting from reason is a higher level or explicit version of what nature, at its lower levels, had already been doing. And that means, however, that there's something approximating to freedom in nature, albeit not yet freedom proper. But the reason why nature, when acting from rational requirements, is doing something that approximates to freedom is this. The more nature acts from rational requirements, the more it's shaping itself independently of efficient causal interactions amongst bits of matter. And conversely, the more nature merely comprises efficient causal interactions amongst bits of matter, the less rationally organised it is. So in the end, Hegel's answer to the question, why is acting from reason free action, his answer isn't so very different from the incompatibilist one after all. The incompatibilist answer to that question would be, acting from reason constitutes acting freely, because when we act from reason we transcend nature as the domain of efficient causal determination. Whereas Hegel's answer is this. When we act from reason, human agents, natural beings, and nature as a whole transcend the domain of efficient causal determination. Or, as he might also put this answer, when nature organises itself in line with reason, its conceptual dimension prevails over its material dimension. Acting from reason is acting freely, not because it's a transcendence of nature, but because it's a transcendence of the material, mechanical dimension in nature, a transcendence that already begins to occur within nature itself. So this is the concluding part, where I'm going to say that having considered all these things, it now begins to seem that Hegel and Schelling are not so obviously compatibilists after all. I've set out some ways that Hegel and Schelling respectively give more weight to reason or freedom within their overall attempts to make those two coincide. And by reviewing that, we'll see how this question about compatibilism or incompatibilism arises. So remember that near the start, I said about Hegel and Schelling's form of compatibilism, that contrary to voluntarism or indeterminism in their standard version, acting from a law that's one's own doesn't require powers that transcend nature, as distinct from being a further elaboration, complication and development of natural powers. Rather, human self-determination just is a further elaboration of the self-organisation that's characteristic of organisms generally. Well, we've now seen how Schelling and Hegel flesh that thesis out. Human free agency arises for Hegel in a reconfiguration of the relations between the dimensions of concept and matter, which are already obtained within the rest of nature. And for Schelling, human free agency arises in a reconfiguration of the relations between productive and inhibiting forces, which also already existed throughout nature. For both of them, these are reconfigurations in which the former element, concept or productivity, gains a new level of predominance over the other element, matter or inhibition. That level of predominance isn't found anywhere else prior to human existence, although nature does contain gradually rising predominance of the concept or productivity over against matter or inhibition. Thus, Hegel and Schelling both believe that there are dimensions of nature that are non-material, respectively the concept for Hegel and productive force for Schelling. And just to clarify as well, the latter, productive force in Schelling, is non-material, because it's only once it becomes mixed with inhibiting force that any material entities begin to arise. So both Hegel and Schelling think that nature already contains an element that transcends the material efficient causal domain. And that's precisely why they can say that human free agency doesn't involve the operation of any power that transcends nature, but is just the further realisation of powers of reason, of creative spontaneity that are already operative in nature. But in that those powers are already operative in nature, this means that within nature itself there's a power that transcends materiality and transcends efficient causation. For Hegel, this is a power to act from reason. It constitutes an approximate form of freedom already to the extent that it transcends efficient causality. For Schelling, this power is to act spontaneously and as such without determination. So the transcendence comes through reason for Hegel and it comes through spontaneity for Schelling. But either way, we have this transcendence of material efficient causation. So then, after all, matters look like this. Just insofar as our free agency further realises powers and processes found in non-human nature, our agency involves transcendence of the efficient causal material domain, because the whole of nature is structured by powers and processes that involve that same transcendence. Our freedom, human freedom, involves nothing that was not already there in less developed shape within non-human nature. There's no new sort of ontological principles or powers coming in to account for human freedom. Everything was already there in nature. But throughout non-human nature, there is already something that transcends materiality and transcends efficient causality. So, to me, it seems a very open question whether this is a compatibilist view or whether in fact it's an incompatibilist view, after all, precisely because we've got a belief in a power to transcend the domain of efficient causation. So I'm just going to leave you with that question. This view of Hegel and Schelling's that I've presented you with, if you agree that it's an accurate account of their views, which you may not. But if we take that to be their view, is it a compatibilist position or an incompatibilist one? That's the question. Thank you.